There's something that happens to empaths after narcissistic abuse that looks like withdrawal, but it's actually one of the most profound transformations in Jungian psychology. They go silent. They disappear from social gatherings. They stop answering calls. They create what looks like isolation, but is actually a sacred cocoon. And while the outside world might judge this as depression or giving up, Carl Jung would recognize it as something entirely different. It's the wounded healer retreating into the underworld, descending into what Jung called the dark night of the soul, not to die, but to be reborn. What you're about to discover will completely reframe how you see this withdrawal. Because according to Jung's theories on individuation, the shadow, and the archetype of the wounded healer, this silence isn't weakness. It's the most powerful act of psychological survival and transformation a person can undertake. And if you're that empath who's gone silent, or if you love someone who has understanding what's actually happening in the depths of this withdrawal, might just change everything you thought you knew about healing from narcissistic abuse. Disclaimer: the content in this video is for educational and informational purposes only and should not replace professional psychological care, therapy, or medical advice. The concepts discussed are drawn from Carl Jung's analytical psychology and contemporary research on empathic sensitivity and narcissistic abuse recovery. The term empath refers to individuals with heightened sensitivity to others' emotions, while narcissist describes behavioral patterns and is not used as a clinical diagnosis. If you're experiencing symptoms of trauma, depression, or any mental health challenges, please seek support from a qualified mental health professional. Complex PTSD from narcissistic abuse is a serious condition that requires professional treatment. This video is meant to provide understanding and perspective, not to serve as therapy or treatment. Let's begin with understanding what Carl Jung meant by the wounded healer, because this archetype is central to comprehending why empaths retreat into silence after narcissistic abuse. Jung drew from the Greek myth of Chiron, the centaur who was accidentally wounded by a poisoned arrow and, despite being a master healer, could never heal his own wound because he was immortal. He lived in perpetual pain, yet this very wound gave him the depth of understanding necessary to heal others. Jung observed that those who enter healing professions, whether as therapists, counselors, nurses, or even as emotional caretakers in their families and friendships, often do so precisely because they themselves have been profoundly wounded. The wound doesn't disqualify them from healing, it qualifies them. As Jung wrote, it is the healer's own hurt that give the measure of their power to heal. Now, empaths are natural wounded healers even before they encounter narcissistic abuse. They're the ones who can feel into another person's pain, who absorb the emotional atmosphere of a room, who instinctively know when something is wrong even when nothing has been said. This isn't just sensitivity. It's a fundamental way of processing reality. Research shows that highly sensitive people, which includes many empaths, have increased activity in brain regions associated with awareness, empathy, and sensory processing. They literally experience the world with more intensity, more depth, more feeling. When such a person encounters a narcissist, something devastating occurs. The narcissist, who operates from a place of emotional deadness and requires constant external validation to feel alive, latches onto the empath's vitality, like a vampire onto a life source. And the empath, programmed by nature and often by childhood wounds to heal and help, throws themselves into what they believe is a sacred mission, to love this person back to wholeness. But here's what Jung understood that most people miss. The narcissist isn't looking to be healed. They're looking to consume. And the dynamic that unfolds isn't a relationship in any authentic sense. It becomes what Jung would recognize as a shadow projection theater. The narcissist projects their disowned shame, emptiness, and self-hatred onto the empath, who then carries these toxic projections while the narcissist maintains their false grandiose self. Meanwhile, the empath projects their own need for validation, their own wounds around worthiness, onto the narcissist, seeing potential and goodness that may not actually exist. Both are relating not to actual people, but to psychological projections. The difference is this: the empath genuinely wants growth and healing, while the narcissist wants only supply and control. Over months or years, the empath experiences what trauma researchers now call complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Their brain literally changes. The amygdala, responsible for threat detection and emotional processing, becomes hyperactive. They're in a constant state of hypervigilance, always scanning for danger, always walking on eggshells. The prefrontal cortex, which handles decision-making, attention, and planning, actually decreases in size and function. This is why empaths in narcissistic relationships often report feeling foggy, unable to make decisions, unable to think clearly. And the hippocampus, which processes and stores memories, also shrinks. This creates a confusing phenomenon where the empath can't quite remember things clearly, can't pin down exactly what happened, which makes them even more vulnerable to the narcissist's gaslighting. On top of these neurological changes, there's the emotional devastation. The empath has poured their entire being into this person, has given everything, has sacrificed their own needs, boundaries, and sometimes even their sense of reality. And despite all of this, despite the unconditional love and endless chances, nothing has changed. The narcissist remains empty, demanding, cruel. This is the moment of profound disillusionment that Jung would recognize as the beginning of the dark night of the soul. Everything the empath believed about love, about their healing abilities, about the fundamental goodness of people, shatters. And this shattering, while excruciating, is actually necessary for what comes next. When the empath finally extracts themselves from a narcissistic relationship, whether through their own decision or because a narcissist has discarded them, something happens that looks to the outside world like a breakdown. The empath withdraws. They stop going out. They stop answering their phone. They cancel plans. They create what appears to be isolation. Family and friends often become concerned, urging them to get back out there, to not let the narcissist win, to move on and be happy. But this advice, however well-intentioned, misunderstands what's actually occurring. The empath isn't having a breakdown. They're having what Jung called a breakthrough. They're entering the cocoon stage of their metamorphosis. Let's explore what Jung meant by introversion, because this is crucial. In popular usage, introversion simply means preferring solitude to socializing. But Jung's definition was far deeper. He saw introversion as the psyche's movement inward toward the unconscious, toward the shadow material that has been denied, repressed, or projected outward. When Jung spoke of the wounded healer, he noted that the wound causes a state of introversion first and foremost. The wound forces us to look inward, to descend into our own psychological underworld. For the empath coming out of narcissistic abuse, this descent isn't optional. Their entire external world has been revealed as built on lies, manipulation, and projection. The only place left to go is inward, and so they withdraw not from weakness, but because the work that needs to happen can only happen in solitude, in silence, in the darkness of their own depths. Now let's talk about why this withdrawal is specifically necessary for empaths as opposed to other personality types. Remember, the empath's gift and curse is that they feel and absorb the emotions of others. They're like emotional sponges, constantly taking in the psychic atmosphere around them. This trait, which Jung would connect to what he called participation mystique, that primitive psychological state where boundaries between self and other become blurred, means that empaths often don't know where they end and others begin. During the narcissistic relationship, this boundary dissolution reached catastrophic levels. The empath was carrying not just their own emotions, but also the narcissist's projected shame, rage, emptiness, and self-hatred. They were living in a constant state of emotional overwhelm, their nervous system flooded with stress hormones, their psyche contaminated with toxic projections they didn't even recognize as not their own. When they finally escape or are discarded, they're not just traumatized, they're psychically polluted. They need what Jung would call a temenos, a sacred protected space where they can begin the work of sorting through what's theirs and what was projected onto them, what's real and what was illusion, who they actually are versus who they became in that toxic dynamic. This is why the empath goes home and stays there. Home becomes a temenos, the alchemical vessel where transformation can occur. Every well-meaning friend who says you just need to get back out there, every family member who suggests you're wallowing, every piece of conventional wisdom that says the best way to get over someone is to get under someone else, all of this completely misses a profound psychological work that needs to happen in this withdrawal phase. Jung understood that the psyche has its own intelligence, its own timing, its own necessary processes. You cannot rush individuation. You cannot skip the descent into the underworld. The empath must withdraw to survive, but more than that, to transform. Let's examine what's actually happening during this period of silence and solitude. First, there's the nervous system recovery. The empath has been living in a state of chronic activation. Their sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight response, constantly engaged. Even when things seem calm, they were braced for the next criticism, the next mood swing, the next manipulation. Their body has been flooded with cortisol and adrenaline for so long that it's become their baseline state. Withdrawal into solitude allows the nervous system to finally downregulate. In the absence of external threats and emotional demands, the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest response, can activate. This isn't just about feeling calmer. This is about physiological healing. The body begins to repair the damage done by chronic stress. Sleep patterns start to normalize. Digestion improves. The immune system strengthens. But this recovery cannot happen if the empath is forcing themselves to socialize, to be okay, to perform normalcy before they're ready. The nervous system needs safety and predictability to heal, and for many empaths, that safety only exists in solitude. Second, there's a cognitive recovery. Remember how the prefrontal cortex, responsible for executive function, shrinks during narcissistic abuse? The empath needs time for this brain region to recover its capacity. During the withdrawal period, in the absence of constant gaslighting and manipulation, the fog begins to lift. Slowly, gradually, the empath starts to remember things clearly. They start to see patterns they couldn't see while they were in it. They start to make connections. This is what therapists call coming out of the trauma bond. But Jung would recognize it as the beginning of consciousness emerging from unconsciousness. The empath is starting to see reality clearly for the first time in months or years. They're remembering who they were before the narcissist. They're recognizing the manipulation tactics that were used. They're understanding the dynamic not as victims wallowing in their pain, but as survivors conducting a forensic analysis of what was done to them. This cognitive work requires silence and solitude. It requires the absence of new input, new emotional demands, new relationships that could cloud or distract from this essential process of making sense of what happened. Third, and this is where Jung's concepts become absolutely critical, there's the shadow work. During the narcissistic relationship, the empath suppressed enormous amounts of their own shadow material. They suppressed their anger because showing anger would trigger narcissistic rage. They suppressed their needs because having needs was labeled as selfish. They suppressed their intuition, their gut feelings that something was wrong, because the narcissist's gaslighting convinced them they were too sensitive, too paranoid, too crazy. They suppressed their healthy self-protection instincts, their boundaries, their capacity to say no. All of this material, all these suppressed, denied, rejected parts of themselves went into what Jung called the shadow, the unconscious repository of everything we cannot accept about ourselves. Now, in the withdrawal period, the shadow begins to emerge. And this is often terrifying for the empath because they start feeling things they've never allowed themselves to feel. They feel rage, not just anger but volcanic, explosive rage at what was done to them. They feel hatred toward the narcissist, toward themselves for staying, toward everyone who failed to help or see what was happening. They feel a desire for revenge, for the narcissist to suffer as they suffered. They feel a cold, hard selfishness, a fuck everyone else protectiveness of their own space and energy that's completely foreign to their usual giving nature. Many empaths are horrified by these shadow emotions. They think something is wrong with them, that they're becoming like the narcissist, that they're losing their goodness. But Jung would say the opposite is true. These shadow emotions aren't signs of becoming bad. They're signs of becoming whole. The rage is healthy. It's the psyche's immune response to abuse. The hatred is clarifying. It's the end of denial and the beginning of discernment. The selfishness isn't narcissism. It's self-preservation. The empath needs to feel these shadow emotions, needs to let them surface and be acknowledged, not to act on them in destructive ways, but to integrate them as valid parts of their psychological makeup. This is shadow work in a Jungian sense. The process of making the unconscious conscious, of bringing into awareness and acceptance those parts of ourselves we denied. And this work cannot be done in public. It cannot be done while socializing and pretending to be fine. It must be done in the darkness, in the privacy of one's own inner world, often with the help of therapists who understands trauma and Jungian psychology. The empath must have the space to be angry, to be hateful, to be selfish, without judgment, without having performed compassion and understanding before they've genuinely integrated their shadow. Fourth, there's what Jung called withdrawal projections. Remember, the empath wasn't just victimized by the narcissist. They also participated in a projection dynamic. They projected onto the narcissist qualities that weren't really there, saw potential that didn't exist, believed in a core goodness that was either absent or so deeply buried as to be inaccessible. They also projected their own need for external validation onto the relationship, unconsciously believing that if they could just love the narcissist well enough, be perfect enough, give enough, then they would finally receive the love and recognition their inner child has always craved. Section 8. The withdrawal period is when these projections must be systematically identified and reclaimed. The empath must face painful truths. They must acknowledge that the person they fell in love with was largely their own creation, a combination of the narcissist's false self-performance and their own projections of what they wanted to see. They must recognize that their desperate attempts to heal and fix the narcissist were actually attempts to heal and fix themselves, projected outward. They must confront the ways their own childhood wounds, often being raised by narcissistic or emotionally unavailable parents, set them up to be attracted to this dynamic in the first place. This is brutal work. It requires radical honesty with oneself. It requires seeing one's own complicity, not in the abuse itself. The narcissist is responsible for their choices, but in the unconscious patterns that made one vulnerable to this type of relationship. And this work absolutely requires solitude. It requires sitting with uncomfortable truths about oneself that it's tempting to run from or rationalize away. In silence and aloneness, with no distractions and no one to perform for, the empath can finally face themselves completely. Fifth, there's the reconstruction of identity. Who is the empath without the narcissist? Who are they without the role of healer, fixer, savior? Who are they when they're not adapting to someone else's moods, managing someone else's emotions, walking on eggshells, trying to be perfect? For many empaths, this is an identity crisis of the highest order because their entire sense of self has been built around being there for others, around being the strong one, the understanding one, the one who can handle anything. The narcissistic relationship pushed this to such extremes that the empath lost themselves completely. They became an extension of the narcissist, existing only to supply narcissistic needs. Section 9. Now, in the aftermath, they must ask the most fundamental question of all, who am I really? And this question, which Jung saw as the central question of individuation, the process of becoming a psychologically whole and unique individual, cannot be answered in the noise and distraction of normal life. It requires deep introspection. It requires experimenting with one's own preferences, without anyone else's input. It requires trying on different aspects of identity to see what actually fits versus what was adopted to please others. The empath in withdrawal might spend hours, days, weeks just being, without productive output, without social interaction, without any of the usual markers of a well-lived life. To the outside world, this looks like depression. And sometimes it is depression, clinical depression, that needs treatment. But often, it's something different. It's the cocoon stage. The caterpillar must dissolve completely before it can become a butterfly. The empath must deconstruct their old identity completely before they can construct a new one based on authentic selfhood rather than adaptation to others. 6. And this relates to a specifically Jungian concept. There's the confrontation with the self with a capital S. In Jung psychology, the self is the archetype of wholeness, the totality of the psyche, both conscious and unconscious, the inner organizing principle that guides individuation. It's different from the ego, which is the conscious sense of I. The self is more like what some spiritual traditions would call the soul or the true nature. During the narcissistic relationship, the empath lost contact with their self. They were living entirely from ego, from the adapted self that tries to survive in the external world. The voice of the self, which often comes through intuition, dreams, physical symptoms, and that deep knowing that something isn't right, was systematically suppressed. Now, in the silence and solitude of withdrawal, the self can finally speak. And what it says is often disturbing to the ego. The self might say you've been living a lie. The self might say you need to completely change your life. The self might say you cannot go back to who you were before. Jung believed that the self orchestrates experiences, including traumatic ones, that force the ego to wake up and begin the individuation process. From this perspective, as brutal as it sounds, the narcissistic abuse was the self's way of destroying an inauthentic life structure that the empath had built, usually to please parents or conform to social expectations. The narcissist was the instrument, not the cause. The cause was the empath's own disconnection from their authentic self, and the universe, or the psyche, or whatever you want to call it, brought this relationship to force a reckoning. During withdrawal, the empath must learn to hear and trust the voice of the self again. This requires silence. It requires turning down the volume on everyone else's opinions, society's expectations, the narcissist's voice that still echoes in their head, all external noise. In that silence, that quiet, that stillness, the self can finally be heard. And what it communicates is often radically different from what the empath's ego wants to hear. Seventh, there's a grief process. Empaths, after narcissistic abuse, are grieving multiple losses simultaneously. They're grieving the loss of the relationship, even though it was toxic, even though leaving was necessary. They're grieving the loss of the person they thought the narcissist was, the potential they saw, the future they imagined. They're grieving the loss of time, months, or years given to someone who couldn't love them back. They're grieving the loss of innocence, the belief in the fundamental goodness of people. They're grieving the loss of their former self, who they were before the abuse changed them. And perhaps most painfully, they're grieving the loss of their healing fantasy, the belief that their love could fix someone, that their empathy could transform someone, that their care could fill someone else's emptiness. This grief cannot be rushed. It has stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and these stages aren't linear. The empath will cycle through them over and over, and grief requires space to unfold. It requires permission to not be okay. It requires the freedom to cry without explanation, to be angry without judgment, to be sad without being told to look on the bright side. The withdrawal period is when this grief can finally be felt and processed fully. In social situations, the empath would have to perform being fine, would have to manage others' discomfort with their pain, would have to reassure people that they're okay. At home, alone, they can finally let themselves fall apart. And this falling apart is necessary. You cannot rebuild without first acknowledging what's been destroyed. You cannot heal without first feeling the depth of the wound. Eighth, there's a recalibration of empathic abilities. This is something that's not often discussed, but is crucial for empaths specifically. During the narcissistic relationship, the empath's natural empathic abilities were weaponized against them. The narcissist used the empath's capacity to feel and absorb emotions to dump their toxic shame, rage, and emptiness. The empath's ability to sense subtle emotional cues was exploited for manipulation. The narcissist, who performed just enough vulnerability to hook the empath back in, would display just enough pain to trigger the empath's healing response. Over time, the empath's empathy became associated with danger and exploitation. Their gift became their curse. Many empaths, after leaving a narcissistic relationship, report that their empathic abilities have either shut down completely, they feel numb and can't connect to emotions at all, or have become hyperactive and uncontrollable. They're overwhelmed by others' emotions to the point of incapacitation. During the withdrawal period, the empath must learn to recalibrate these abilities. They must learn discernment, the difference between feeling with someone versus feeling for someone, the difference between empathy and absorption. They must develop what some call being a conscious empath versus an unconscious one. An unconscious empath automatically absorbs everything, has no filters, no boundaries, no choice in what they take on. A conscious empath can sense others' emotions but chooses whether and how to respond, maintains clear boundaries, and doesn't lose themselves in others' experiences. This recalibration cannot happen while the empath is in social situations being bombarded with others' emotional energy. It requires time alone to feel what their own baseline emotional state is without input from others. It requires learning to distinguish my feeling from your feeling. It requires building energetic and psychological boundaries that didn't exist before. The silence and solitude of withdrawal is the training ground for these new skills. Ninth, there's a restoration of personal sovereignty. Jung spoke about individuation as becoming who you truly are rather than who others want you to be. For empaths after narcissistic abuse, this means reclaiming their sovereignty, their right to exist as separate beings with their own needs, feelings, preferences, and boundaries. During the narcissistic relationship, the empath had no sovereignty. Their needs were dismissed as selfish. Their feelings were invalidated as too sensitive. Their preferences were overridden by the narcissist's demands. Their boundaries were violated constantly. They existed as an extension of the narcissist, a narcissistic supply object, rather than a person in their own right. The psychological term for this is engulfment, and it's devastating to one's sense of self. In withdrawal, the empath begins a slow process of establishing sovereignty. They make decisions based solely on what they want without having to consider anyone else's reaction. They eat what they want to eat, wear what they want to wear, spend their time how they want to spend it. These seem like small things, but for someone who's been controlled and manipulated, these are revolutionary acts of self-determination. They say no to social invitations without guilt. They create boundaries around their time and energy without explanation or apology. They prioritize their own healing over others' comfort with their healing process. This restoration of sovereignty is deeply threatening to people who knew the empath as the person who was always available, always accommodating, always putting others first. Family and friends often react negatively to this new boundary setting, this new no-saying, this new self-prioritization. They might accuse the empath of becoming selfish, of being changed by the abuse in a bad way, of not being themselves anymore. But Jung would recognize this as a necessary stage of individuation. The empath is differentiating from the collective, from the family system, from the expectations that have been placed on them since childhood. They're finding their own values rather than living by inherited ones. They're becoming a sovereign individual rather than an unconscious participant in group psychology. And this process, this claiming of personal sovereignty, absolutely requires protection of withdrawal. The empath cannot simultaneously establish sovereignty and deal with other people's reactions to it. They need space to become solid in their new boundaries before testing them in relationship. 10th, there's the spiritual dimension that Jung would recognize as essential. Many empaths report that their withdrawal period involves a profound spiritual crisis and awakening. Everything they believed about the nature of love, goodness, and justice has been shattered by the narcissistic abuse. If they had religious beliefs, they might question how a loving God could allow such suffering. If they believed in karma or that good things happen to good people, the narcissistic relationship proves otherwise. They're in what mystics call the dark night of the soul, that period of spiritual desolation where all former comforts and certainties have fallen away. Jung understood that this dark night, while terrifying, is often a doorway to genuine spiritual experience as opposed to spiritual belief. When all the concepts and ideas about spirituality are stripped away, when you can't rely on prayers or affirmations or positive thinking, because none of it seems to work, you're forced into direct experience of the mystery. Many empaths report that during their withdrawal, they have profound experiences of synchronicities that provide guidance, of dreams that offer healing imagery, of spontaneous insights that come in silence, of feeling connected to something larger than themselves, even while feeling utterly alone. Jung would say the self is reaching out to the ego through these experiences, attempting to guide the individuation process. The spiritual function of the psyche is activated by the crisis, offering a new way of being that isn't based on ego control or magical thinking, but on surrender to a wisdom larger than the personal self. This spiritual awakening cannot be forced or scheduled. It emerges from the darkness, from a void, from the space created by withdrawal. The empath must become empty before they can be filled with something new. They must die to their old life before they can be reborn into a new one. And this death-rebirth process, which Jung saw as central to individuation, and which appears in every wisdom tradition as the hero's journey or the mystical path, requires descent into the underworld, into the alone, into the silence. 11th, there's a concept Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to hold and unite opposites. Before the narcissistic abuse, The empath likely had a relatively simplistic, black and white view of themselves and the world. People were either good or bad. They themselves were the good person trying to help the troubled person. Love meant sacrificing and giving. Boundaries meant being mean or selfish. During and after the abuse, these simplistic views shatter. The empath discovers that they contain both light and shadow, both goodness and capacity for hatred. They discover that some people can appear good while being profoundly destructive. They discover that sometimes saying no is the most loving thing, that boundaries are what make authentic relationship possible, that taking care of oneself isn't selfish. It's necessary for survival. They're learning to hold paradox, to embrace complexity, to accept that life isn't black and white, but endlessly nuanced shades of gray. Jung called this capacity to hold opposites without collapsing into one side the transcendent function, and he saw it as the hallmark of psychological maturity and wholeness. The transcendent function allows you to be both vulnerable and boundaried, both compassionate and discerning, both open and protected. It allows you to love yourself and hold yourself accountable. It allows you to acknowledge your wounds and claim your strength. Developing this capacity requires a kind of deep reflective work that only happens in solitude. The empath must sit with contradictions, with opposites, with the ways they can be both victim and agent, both innocent and complicit in different aspects of their story. They must develop what Jung called the self-observing ego, the part of consciousness that can witness itself without judgment, that can see patterns without shame. This is advanced psychological work. It's what Jung called the second half of life work, where the goal isn't success or adaptation or pleasing others, but becoming whole, integrated, authentically oneself. And the empath's withdrawal period is when this work begins in earnest. 12. Let's address a phenomenon of what happens when empaths start to emerge from their cocoon and why many retreat back into it multiple times. This is a regression or weakness. It's part of the natural process. Think of a crab molting its shell. The crab must shed its old, hard exterior to grow, but for a time it's completely vulnerable, soft-bodied, defenseless. It must hide until the new shell hardens. The empath is molting their old psychological shell, the adapted self that could survive narcissistic abuse but cannot thrive in authentic life. As they begin to emerge, to venture back into social situations, to try connecting with others again, they often discover they're not ready. Their new boundaries aren't solid yet. Their ability to maintain sovereignty in the presence of others' demands isn't strong enough yet. Their discernment about who is safe and who isn't hasn't fully developed yet. So they get hurt again, not necessarily by narcissists, but by normal people with normal expectations that the empath can't meet yet. Or they find themselves slipping into old patterns, overgiving, over-explaining, trying to manage others' emotions, losing themselves in someone else's needs. And so they retreat again, back to silence, back to solitude, back to the safety of aloneness. People in their lives often interpret this as a setback, as the empath not really healing or making progress. But Jung would understand this as a spiral path of individuation. You don't go straight up from unconsciousness to consciousness. You circle the same issues at deeper and deeper levels. Each retreat into withdrawal is actually a return to integration work at a new depth. The empath might have thought they were done processing the anger, but a triggering situation reveals there's more anger to feel and integrate. They thought they'd established boundaries, but a manipulative person reveals the boundaries still have holes. They thought they reclaimed their identity, but a moment of praise from the wrong person reveals they're still seeking external validation. So they go back into cocoon, not because they failed, but because the psyche knows there's more work to do. And this is okay. This is a natural rhythm of deep psychological transformation, integration, testing in the world, discovering what still needs work, return to integration. With each cycle, the empath becomes stronger, clearer, more solidly themselves. Section 17. 13th. Let's talk about the social pressure empaths face to not withdraw, to get over it, to move on, and why this pressure is not only unhelpful but actively harmful. We live in a culture that's deeply uncomfortable with introversion, with silence, with withdrawal from productivity and social participation. We're told that mental health looks like being happy, social, productive. We're told that healing means getting back to normal, as quickly as possible. We're told that spending time alone is unhealthy, that isolation is dangerous, that you need to push yourself to get out there even when you don't feel like it. For empaths after narcissistic abuse, this cultural narrative is gaslighting in a new form. It's telling them that their instinct to withdraw, their need for solitude, their inability to perform normalcy is wrong. It's pathologizing the very process that Jung would recognize as essential for transformation. The wounded healer must ascend into their own underworld. They must confront their own shadow. They must sit with their own pain in the darkness before they can emerge with the wisdom to help others. This cannot be rushed. This cannot be skipped. And when well-meaning people try to pull the empath out of their withdrawal prematurely, they're actually interrupting the healing process. They're like someone who keeps opening the cocoon to check if the butterfly is ready yet, not understanding that the chrysalis must remain sealed for complete transformation to occur. The empath needs permission to not be okay. They need validation that their withdrawal is not only acceptable, but wise. They need people in their lives who can say, take all the time you need. We'll be here when you're ready, without pressure, without timelines, without making their discomfort with the empath's process into the empath's problem to manage. Jung had a term for this, holding space, though he might call it creating a temenos for another's process. Some people are capable of this kind of supportive presence. They can tolerate the empath's pain without trying to fix it. They can accept the empath's need for solitude without taking it personally. They can trust the empath's own wisdom about what they need without imposing their own agenda. These people are rare and precious. An empath often discovers during this withdrawal period who these people actually are. Many relationships that seem solid before the abuse reveal themselves as conditional. Friends who say they're there for the empath become frustrated when the empath doesn't bounce back on their expected timeline. Family members who claim to be supportive become critical when the empath's healing process disrupts family systems or expectations. The empath discovers that many relationships in their life were actually based on their role as the strong one, the giver, the emotional support. When they can no longer play that role, these relationships fall away. This is another loss to grieve, but it's also a clarifying revelation. It shows the empath who actually loves them for themselves versus who love the function they served. And strange as it sounds, this loss of inauthentic relationships is actually a gift. It clears space for genuine connections to form later. Connections based on the empath's true self rather than their adapted self. 14th, let's explore what Jung called the symbols of transformation and how they show up during the empath's withdrawal. Jung was fascinated by symbols, not as arbitrary meanings we assign, but as the psyche's natural language. Dreams, art, myth, synchronicity. These are how the unconscious communicates with consciousness. During the withdrawal period, empaths often report an increase in symbolic communication from their psyche. They have vivid, archetypal dreams. They feel drawn to certain myths or stories that seem to mirror their experience. They notice synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seem too perfect to be random. Jung would say the self is communicating through these symbols, guiding the individuation process, offering healing images and insights that the conscious ego couldn't access on its own. Common symbolic themes include death and rebirth, descending into caves or underwater realms and emerging transformed, encountering wise old figures who offer guidance, confronting shadow figures or monsters and either integrating or defeating them, finding hidden treasures or forgotten rooms in familiar houses. These aren't just random dream images. They're the psyche's way of processing the trauma and charting the path forward. The empath who pays attention to these symbols, who perhaps keeps a dream journal or creates art based on these images, is actively participating in their own healing at a deep unconscious level. This is Jungian active imagination, the practice of engaging consciously with unconscious material, and it requires the quiet and space of withdrawal. You cannot access these deep symbolic layers of psyche while you're busy managing external demands and social obligations. They emerge in a liminal space between sleep and waking in meditation, in the quiet moments of solitude that withdrawal provides. 15th, let's discuss the concept of the temptation to return, because this is one of the most difficult challenges empaths face during withdrawal. The narcissist, if they're aware the empath has withdrawn, will often launch a hoovering campaign. They'll reach out with promises of change, with apologies, with declarations of love and need. They might send flying monkeys, mutual friends, or family members to plead their case or report on how much the narcissist is suffering without the empath. They might create emergencies or crises designed to trigger the empath's helper instinct. And here's what makes this so difficult. The empath in withdrawal is in a vulnerable state. They're grieving. They're lonely. They're questioning everything. And the narcissist hoovering can seem like the answer, proof that they were wrong to leave, that the narcissist really does love them, that everything can be fixed if they just go back. Jung understood this temptation as the pull back toward unconsciousness. The individuation process is hard. It requires confronting painful truths about oneself and one's life. It requires giving up comforting illusions. It requires tolerating uncertainty and aloneness. The narcissist represents a return to the familiar, to the known, even though the known was toxic. There's a psychological comfort in familiar pain versus unfamiliar transformation. But the empath returns to the narcissist during this vulnerable withdrawal period. Several things happen. First, all the healing work they've done unravels. The nervous system redysregulates. The cognitive clarity fogs over again. The boundaries dissolve. They're back in the trauma bond, often more deeply than before. Second, the narcissist will punish them for leaving. Even if the narcissist is the one who reached out and begged them to return, they will never forgive the empath for having the audacity to leave in the first place. The abuse typically escalates. Third, the empath's confidence in their own judgment is shattered even more deeply. They knew they needed to stay away. They felt it, and yet they went back. This creates a profound sense of self-betrayal that's devastating to the emerging sense of sovereignty. So, how does the empath resist this temptation? Jung would say through consciousness. By understanding the pull toward a narcissist not as evidence of love, but as a psyche's resistance to transformation, as the ego's fear the unknown, as the trauma bond's biochemical grip. The empath must make the unconscious conscious, must see clearly what going back would mean, must hold the tension between the temporary relief of familiar pain and the long-term possibility of genuine healing. This is where support is crucial. Not support that enables a return, but support that validates how hard it is to resist while holding firm that going back is not an option. A trauma-informed therapist, a support group for narcissistic abuse survivors, trusted friends who understand the dynamic. These lifelines can make the difference between falling back into the abyss and continuing the difficult journey forward. 16th, let's talk about what Jung called the Jungian, the sacred marriage of opposites within the psyche, and how this relates to the empath's eventual emergence from withdrawal. The entire journey we've been describing, the descent into silence and solitude, the shadow work, the grief, the confrontation with self, the development of sovereignty, all of this is preparation for the Jungian. In alchemical terms, which Jung used extensively, the Jungian is the union of the masculine and feminine principles within, the integration of all the pairs of opposites, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, strength and vulnerability, giving and receiving. For the empath, who before the abuse was identified almost entirely with giving, with feeling, with adaptability, with softness, the journey through withdrawal forces them to develop the opposite qualities. They must learn to receive, to think clearly and analytically about what happened, to be firm and unyielding in their boundaries, to be hard when necessary. But the goal isn't to swing entirely to the other extreme, to become cold, closed off, cynical. The goal is integration, the ability to access both sides as needed, to be both empathic and discerning, both open and boundaried, both compassionate and self-protecting. This is the Jungian, and it's the fruit of the entire withdrawal and transformation process. When the empath finally emerges from their cocoon, they're no longer the person who entered the narcissistic relationship. They're not even the person who left it. They've been transformed at the deepest levels of their being. They have what Jung would call a stronger ego-self axis. Their conscious ego is now in dialogue with a deeper self rather than being buffeted by unconscious complexes and projections. They have integrated their shadow. The rage, the hatred, the selfishness. These are no longer terrifying aspects to be repressed, but understood as valid parts of their psychological makeup that can be expressed appropriately when needed. They have boundaries that are firm yet flexible. They know their limits and enforce them without guilt. Yet they can still be open and vulnerable with people who've earned that trust. They have discernment, the ability to sense red flags early and act on them immediately rather than overriding their intuition with rationalization or hope. They have sovereignty, a solid sense of self that isn't dependent on external validation and can't be shaken by someone else's opinion or manipulation. And perhaps most importantly, they have what Jung called the self-observing capacity. They can watch themselves, notice when they're slipping into old patterns, and make different choices in real time. They become conscious in ways that most people never achieve. This consciousness, this wholeness, this integration, it couldn't have been achieved without the descent into withdrawal. The caterpillar had to dissolve in the darkness of the cocoon to become the butterfly. The seed had to be buried in the dark earth to become the tree. The empath had to retreat into silence and solitude to emerge as a transformed being. 17th. Let's address what the empath's emergence looks like and why it often surprises everyone who knew them before. When the empath finally starts to re-engage with the world, people expect them to be broken, diminished, scarred in visible ways. Instead, they often encounter someone who's more solid, more radiant, more powerful than the person who withdrew. There's a calmness to the transformed empath, a centeredness that wasn't there before. They don't react to drama. They don't get hooked by manipulation. They don't over-explain or over-apologize. They simply state their truth and let it stand. There's a clarity in their eyes. The fog has lifted. They see people accurately now, not through projections or wishful thinking, but as they actually are. This means they quickly identify and distance from toxic people, which can upset social groups and family systems that relied on the empath to smooth over dysfunction. There's a selectivity in their relationships. They're no longer available to everyone. They're no longer the go-to person for emotional support unless the relationship is genuinely reciprocal. They've learned that their empathy is a gift to be given consciously and selectively, not a resource to be extracted by anyone who demands it. There's often a creative flowering. Many empaths report that after their withdrawal and transformation, they're finally doing the creative work they always wanted to do but suppressed. They're writing, painting, making music, starting businesses, pursuing education, living authentically in ways they never allowed themselves before. Jung would say the libido, the psychic energy that was bound up in a toxic relationship and in maintaining the false adapted self, is now freed for creative expression and genuine life. There's also often a spiritual depth that surprises people. The empath who went into withdrawal maybe as an agnostic or someone with conventional religious beliefs emerges with a direct, lived spiritual experience. They've been to the underworld and returned. They've confronted death, psychic death, and been reborn. They have a knowing that can't be taught, only earned through the journey. And perhaps most noticeably, there's a zero-tolerance policy for disrespect and toxicity. The transformed empath doesn't give second chances to people who show them who they are the first time. They don't stay in situations that feel wrong hoping things will improve. They don't sacrifice their peace for anyone. This can seem harsh to people who knew the old empath, the one who was endlessly patient and forgiving. But Jung would recognize this as the healthy integration of the shadow's protective aggression with the light's compassion. It's not coldness, it's wisdom. 18th. Let's talk about the phenomenon of other people's discomfort with the transformed empath. This is something that often blindsides empaths who've done this deep work. They expect that their healing will be celebrated, that their newfound strength and boundaries will be respected. Instead, they often encounter resistance, criticism, and even rejection from people they thought would be supportive. Family members say you've changed, and not in a good way. Friends complain that you're not fun anymore or that you're too serious. Co-workers are uncomfortable with your new assertiveness. Romantic interests are put off by your strong boundaries. What's happening is that the empath has disrupted the collective unconscious of their social systems. Jung understood that families, friend groups, and communities operate with unconscious agreements about roles each person will play. The empath was a designated feeler, the caretaker, the one who absorbed everyone's emotions and held a family or group together through their endless giving and adapting. When they stop playing this role, when they claim sovereignty and enforce boundaries, the entire system becomes unstable. Other people have to start feeling their own feelings, managing their own emotions, taking responsibility for their own needs. And they don't like it. They want the old empath back. They pressure, guilt trip, and manipulate to try to force the empath back into the old role. This is an incredibly difficult phase for the empath because they're being punished for healing, criticized for having boundaries, rejected for being healthy. It can make them doubt their transformation, wonder if they've gone too far, if they're being selfish or harsh. But Jung would say this discomfort others feel is proof that the individuation process is working. When you differentiate from the collective, when you stop carrying projections, when you refuse to play assigned roles, you will be met with resistance. The collective wants you to stay unconscious because your consciousness disrupts the collective unconsciousness. The empath must hold firm through this phase. They must trust that their transformation is right and necessary even when everyone around them says it's wrong. They must be willing to lose relationships that cannot adapt to their new wholeness. This is a loneliness of individuation that Jung spoke about, the reality that becoming truly yourself often means standing apart from the collective, at least for a time. 19th, let's explore the concept of post-traumatic growth and how it relates to the empath's journey through withdrawal and transformation. Modern psychology has documented what Jung understood intuitively, that severe trauma can, if processed consciously rather than repressed, lead to profound positive changes in personality, worldview, and life direction. Research on post-traumatic growth identifies 5 key areas of transformation: greater appreciation for life and change priorities. The empath who survived narcissistic abuse often reports a newfound gratitude for simple things, for peaceful moments, for authentic connections. They've stared into the abyss and returned with clarity about what actually matters: warmer, more intimate relationships with select people. While the empath may have fewer relationships after their transformation, the ones they maintain are deeper and more genuine than anything they experienced before. They've learned the difference between width and depth in relationships, and they choose depth, a greater sense of personal strength. The empath knows what they survived. They know what they endured and transcended. This gives them a confidence that isn't based on achievements or others' approval, but on tested resilience, recognition of new possibilities, or paths for one's life. Many empaths report that the narcissistic abuse, horrible as it was, destroyed an inauthentic life and forced them onto a path more aligned with their true self. They often completely change careers, relationships, locations, living in ways they never would have had the courage to without being forced by crisis, spiritual or existential development. The empath has been forced to confront ultimate questions about the nature of evil, about suffering, about meaning, about their own mortality. This confrontation, if engaged rather than avoided, leads to a depth of spiritual understanding that casual belief never provides. Jung's entire psychology was essentially about facilitating post-traumatic growth. Though he didn't call it that, individuation is post-traumatic growth. The integration of shadow is post-traumatic growth. The confrontation with the self is post-traumatic growth. The withdrawal period is where this growth is cultivated. The silence and solitude provide the conditions for the seed of trauma to transform into the flower of wisdom. But here's what's crucial to understand. Post-traumatic growth doesn't mean the trauma was good or necessary. It doesn't mean we should be grateful for abuse. It doesn't minimize the pain or excuse the abuser. What it means is that human consciousness has the capacity to extract meaning and growth even from the worst experiences. And the empath, through their withdrawal and shadow work and individuation process, activates this capacity. They transform lead into gold, to use the alchemical metaphor Jung loved. They take the worst thing that's happened to them and refuse to let it be only destruction. They alchemize it into wisdom, strength, depth. This is the wounded healer's journey complete. The wound that seemed like it would destroy them becomes the source of their deepest gifts. And finally, the 20th and final concept we need to explore is what comes after withdrawal and transformation. What does life look like for the empath who has completed this journey? Jung would say they've achieved a significant degree of individuation, though individuation is a lifelong process never fully complete. They are more themselves than they've ever been. They live from their authentic self rather than from adapted ego. They have access to their full range of psychological functions, thinking, feeling, sensing, intuiting, rather than being one-sided. They can be in relationship without losing themselves. They can be alone without being lonely. They can give without depleting themselves. They can receive without feeling guilty. They have what Jung called psychological consciousness, the ability to observe their own processes, to notice when old patterns are activating, to make conscious choices rather than unconscious reactions. They still have triggers. The trauma of narcissistic abuse doesn't disappear, but they have the tools and awareness to manage triggers without being controlled by them. They can feel the activation, name it, and let it pass without acting from it. They're selective about who they let into their inner circle. They've learned that not everyone deserves access to their depth, their vulnerability, their gifts. They maintain friendly but bounded relationships with most people and reserve true intimacy for the rare few who can meet them at depth. They've often found their vocation, their calling, the work that uses their gift in ways that are meaningful to them. For many empaths, this involves some form of healing work, becoming therapists, counselors, coaches, artists who create healing art, teachers, writers. They become conscious wounded healers, helping others precisely because they've traveled the underworld themselves. They have a relationship with their own psyche. They pay attention to dreams, to intuitions, to the subtle communications from their unconscious. They engage in practices that maintain the ego self-axis, meditation, journaling, therapy, creative expression, whatever works for them. They've accepted that they will always be more sensitive, more feeling, more affected by others than most people. But they've learned to work with this sensitivity rather than seeing it as a flaw. They use it consciously as a tool for discernment and connection rather than letting it use them as an unconscious absorption mechanism. They have peace, not the peace of a life without challenges, but the peace of someone who knows who they are, what they stand for, what they will and will not tolerate. The peace of someone who has integrated their shadow and no longer fears their own depths. The peace of someone who has died and been reborn and knows experientially that transformation is possible. And here's the beautiful paradox that brings us full circle to where we started. The empath went silent and withdrew not because they were weak, but because they were wise. The wisdom was unconscious at first, an instinct towards self-preservation and healing. But through the process of conscious engagement with the withdrawal, through shadow work and grief and confrontation with self, the unconscious wisdom became conscious. They understand now why they had to withdraw. They understand now what was happening in that silence and solitude. They understand now that it wasn't an ending, but a beginning. The cocoon was necessary for the metamorphosis. The descent into the underworld was necessary for the ascent into consciousness. The silence was necessary for finding their authentic voice. The solitude was necessary for learning true intimacy. The apparent breakdown was necessary for breakthrough. And if you're an empath currently in withdrawal, currently in that silent solitude, currently questioned by everyone about why you won't just get over it and move on, know this. You are not broken. You are not weak. You are not failing. You are in the most sacred and powerful phase of psychological transformation that exists. You are in the cocoon. You are dissolving and reforming. You are dying to who you were and being born into who you truly are. This process cannot be rushed. It cannot be skipped. It cannot be done in public or while performing normalcy for others' comfort. It requires exactly what you're doing. Silence, solitude, withdrawal from a world that doesn't understand. Trust your instinct. Trust your need for this protective space. Trust that your psyche knows what it's doing even when your conscious mind is confused and scared. The silence isn't emptiness. It's pregnant with possibility. The solitude isn't loneliness. It's a sacred aloneness where you finally meet yourself. The withdrawal isn't giving up. It's gathering strength. And when you emerge, not according to anyone else's timeline, but according to your own soul schedule, you will be transformed. You will be whole. You will be powerful in ways you cannot imagine from where you are now. You will be the conscious wounded healer, the individuated self, the person you were always meant to become. The narcissistic abuse, as devastating as it was, will have become the crucible of your transformation. Not because the abuse was good, but because you were wise enough and strong enough and brave enough to use it as the catalyst for your own rebirth. And that, ultimately, is what Carl Jung understood about the wounded healer's journey. The wound doesn't destroy you if you're willing to descend into it, to feel it fully, to extract its wisdom. The wound transforms you, and the silence, the withdrawal, the going home and staying there, that's not the end of your story. It's the middle, the chrysalis, the sacred pause between who you were and who you're becoming. Honor it, protect it, trust it, because on the other side of the silence is your authentic voice, stronger and truer than it's ever been before. Disclaimer: the content in this video is for educational and informational purposes only and should not replace professional psychological care, therapy, or medical advice. The concepts discussed are drawn from Carl Jung's analytical psychology and contemporary research on empathic sensitivity and narcissistic abuse recovery. The term empath refers to individuals with heightened sensitivity to others' emotions, while narcissist describes behavioral patterns and is not used as a clinical diagnosis. If you are experiencing symptoms of trauma, depression, or any mental health challenges, please seek support from a qualified mental health professional. Complex PTSD from narcissistic abuse is a serious condition that requires professional treatment. This video is meant to provide understanding and perspective, not to serve as therapy or treatment.